You think cowboys swung open those saloon doors just for whiskey? Think again. Because behind the bar and under the haze of pipe smoke, saloons served up more than liquor and poker games. They dished out some of the strangest, richest, and most unexpected meals the frontier ever saw. We're talking recipes that sound like tall tales. These weren't myths whispered around the fire. These were real meals. Ordered, served, and eaten by real cowboys, gamblers, and gunslingers across the Wild West. So tonight, we're not just pouring a drink. We're sitting down at the table. Let's dig into 25 dishes you'd never guess were on the menu in Wild West saloons. 1. Son of a gun stew. At first, it sounded like a joke, until you saw the pot. Son of a gun stew was the ultimate don't ask, just eat dish of the trail. Born from necessity, perfected by chuck wagon cooks, it followed the law of the West, waste nothing. When a cow was butchered, the good cuts were shipped or sold. The rest, heart, liver, tripe, marrow gut, sweetbreads, even the brain, were chopped, simmered, and stewed until tender. Into the kettle went onions, potatoes, maybe carrots or wild herbs if fortune allowed. Out came a thick, peppery broth with a flavor that lingered as long as the memory of what you just swallowed. In some towns, it was a rite of passage. A cowboy's grit wasn't measured by how fast he could draw a Colt 45, but by whether he could stare down a bowl of son of a gun stew and clean it. Why did saloons ladle it out? Because it was cheap, it was filling, and it kept the men upright after weeks in the saddle. A hot bowl of mystery meat meant survival, even if it came with a side of dread. 2. Sourdough flapjacks. Before diners and truck stops, the cowboy's breakfast was simple: flapjacks. But these weren't the fluffy pancakes you see today. These were frontier cakes, flat, chewy, sour with age, and cooked on cast iron and bacon grease until the edges crisped like lace. The magic came from the starter. A bubbling, living sourdough culture, carried in tins, wrapped in cloth, sometimes even tied to the saddle so the jostle of the ride kept it breathing. That starter was a cook's pride, fed daily with flour and water, guarded closer than gold. Lose it, and you lost breakfast. In saloons, flapjacks came hot off the skillet at any hour, morning, midnight, or when a cowboy staggered in after 3 days on the trail. They were heavy, they were filling, and they stayed with you. Some cowboys called them sinkers, because once they hit your belly, they weren't going anywhere. Served with molasses, canned fruit, or pork drippings if the saloon was well stocked, they weren't dainty. They were survival on a plate. And the last flapjack in the stack, that one got the last spoonful of syrup, if the barkeep hadn't already stolen it for himself. 3. Fried salt pork and beans. If the West had a single anthem on a plate, this was it. Every saloon west of the Mississippi kept a kettle of beans simmering low, a promise waiting for the next hungry rider to stumble in. Pinto or navy beans, soaked overnight until they swelled, then boiled slow until they gave up their toughness. Into the mix went pork, salt pork, a fatty cut packed in brine strong enough to outlast winter, tougher than bacon, saltier than ham, and built to endure long journeys in barrels. Cooks sliced it thick, fried it in its own fat until the edges curled, then spooned it over beans that had been softening all day. If the town had molasses, onions, or lard, they went in for extra flavor. If not, grease alone carried the dish. Add a hunk of cornbread or a slab of day-old sourdough, and you had fuel that could carry a cowboy from dawn to dusk, from roundup to poker. Some saloons even kept beans on offer 24 hours a day because no man wanted to drink whiskey on an empty stomach, and no barkeep wanted the mess if he did. 4. Chuck wagon coffee. Ask 10 cowboys to describe it, and you'd hear the same words. Black as tar, strong enough to float a horseshoe, and bitter enough to bite back. Chuck wagon coffee wasn't a delicacy. It was lifeblood. Grounds were thrown straight into a battered pot of boiling water, no filters, no measure. To settle the floating grit, cooks cracked eggshells into the pot or tossed in salt, even a scrap of rawhide when nothing else was at hand. Strange tricks, but the result was drinkable enough. Saloons kept one pot blackened from constant use, never washed, just topped off again and again till the coffee grew thick with memory. Drop a coin or a nugget of gold dust if luck had been kind, and you'd get a tin cup filled to the brim. Cowboys drank it before breakfast, after poker, or when they couldn't afford to sleep. Strong enough to jolt a man upright after a week in the saddle. And if the barkeep liked you, or just wanted to see you squirm, he might fix it with a splash of whiskey, turning bitter into fire. 5. Prairie oysters, Rocky Mountain oysters. This dish separated the locals from the greenhorns in a single bite. Prairie oysters, known today as Rocky Mountain oysters, weren't pulled from the sea. They came from the roundup, from the branding fires, from the corrals where ranch work got bloody and necessary. They were bull testicles, sliced, battered, and fried in tallow until crisp and golden. Cowboys didn't waste meat, not even the parts most folks preferred to ignore. Castration was ranch business, and what came of it was supper. Saloons in Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas turned the practice into ritual. Plates of prairie oysters were passed around with vinegar, mustard, or hot sauce, often washed down with beer or rye whiskey. It wasn't about taste, it was about toughness. Eating them marked you as part of the place, someone who belonged to the range. Refuse a plate, and you might get laughed clean out of the bar, but finish them. Grin still on your face, and you earned respect. Some men swore they were delicious. Others swore they'd never recover. Either way, the plate told its own story. 6. Rabbit stew. When beef was scarce or too expensive to touch, cowboys turned to what the prairie offered, and more often than not, that meant rabbit. Lean, plentiful, and quick to catch with a rifle or a snare, rabbits became the salvation of chuck wagon cooks and saloon kitchens alike. A good rabbit stew started with the meat browned in pork fat or tallow, then simmered slow with potatoes, onions, carrots, and whatever else was on hand. On the plains, it stayed plain. In the Southwest, chilies, cumin, and garlic crept into the pot, weaving Mexican and native flavors into cowboy fare. The result was hearty, warming, and surprisingly complex for something pulled from a field. A bowl of rabbit stew was comfort for men who hadn't seen home in years, who had grown tired of hardtack and beans, and who wanted something that tasted alive again. In many saloons, it wasn't just a meal, it was a memory served steaming hot. 7. Squirrel fricassee. Yes, squirrel. In the timber country of Missouri, Arkansas, and beyond, squirrel wasn't just the last resort, it was a staple. Abundant, cheap, and shockingly flavorful, it filled pots when beef or pork couldn't. The fricassee method, borrowed from European settlers, meant squirrel was lightly fried, then dropped into a pan of drippings, flour, and milk, simmering into a creamy, peppered gravy. Served over biscuits or cornbread, it became a dish that stuck to your ribs and warmed the spirit. You wouldn't find it advertised on a chalkboard out front. It was a word-of-mouth special. The kind of meal barkeeps whispered to regulars who knew how to make the most of what rustled in the trees. For newcomers, squirrel might have seemed strange, but for old-timers, it was tradition. A taste of the woods and proof that saloons were more than whiskey halls. They were community kitchens built on resourcefulness and local fare. 8. Corn Dodger biscuits. Cowboys didn't always have yeast, but they had cornmeal, and that was enough. Corn Dodgers were rough biscuits. Dense, gritty ovals mixed from scalding water, cornmeal, salt, and sometimes a spoonful of bacon grease. They were fried in pans, baked on hot rocks, or crisped in the embers of a fire. They didn't look like much, but they traveled well. Tucked into a bedroll, wrapped in cloth, ready to be reheated come dawn. In saloons, cooks dressed them up with molasses or served them alongside beans, stews, and gravies. The texture was coarse, the flavor smoky, the kind of food that made you chew slow and work for it. But they filled bellies when nothing else would. Some cowboys carried Dodgers in their saddlebags for days, knowing they'd survive heat, cold, or rain. 9. Pickled eggs. Every saloon worth its salt had a jar of them. Cloudy glass on the counter, pale orbs floating in vinegar like strange trophies. Pickled eggs were the quick bite of the West. Boiled hard, then steeped for days or weeks in brine heavy with vinegar, salt, mustard seed, peppercorns, and sometimes beet juice or chilies for kick. By the time they were ready, they were sour, salty, sharp, and strong enough to wake a man's tongue from its slumber. No forks, no plates. You dropped a coin, fished one out, cracked the shell, and swallowed it whole, chasing it with beer or rye if you had the money. They were cheap fuel, a cowboy's fast food, ready in seconds. Some saloons even paired them with hot sauce, turning them into a kind of frontier bar snack combo. Today, they look like movie props. Back then, they were survival in a jar. And sometimes the only thing standing between a cowboy's whiskey and his stomach. 10. Hardtack and gravy. They called it toothbreaker, molar chipper, or simply hardtack. This biscuit was baked until it could last years. Flour, water, salt, nothing more. Tough as a board, harder than the knife used to cut it, and nearly impossible to chew straight. But saloons knew how to make it edible. They softened it, soaked it in broth or water until it bent, then smothered it in pan gravy made from pork drippings, flour, and pepper. Sometimes onions or bacon bits found their way in. Most times, grease alone did the job. What you got was a dish halfway between survival and comfort. Warm, filling, and, if you squinted, delicious. For a cowboy used to gnawing hardtack raw on the trail, a plate of it swimming in gravy was a small luxury. Proof that in the West, the right cook could turn even a brick into supper. 11. Buffalo roast. Before cattle fences crossed the plains, the buffalo reigned. Millions thundered across the grass, and for a time, their meat fed the frontier. Saloons near railways or hunting camps often served buffalo roast as a prize dish. The meat was lean, dark, with a taste closer to venison than beef. Humps were the choicest cut, tender when roasted slow, basted in fat and salt. Carved thin, smothered in gravy, and plated with potatoes, it felt like wealth on a tin dish. Buffalo roast became a status meal. Miners with fresh pay, gamblers flush with winnings, ranchers celebrating a drive. They ordered it to mark the occasion. Ironically, demand was so fierce it helped drive the herds to near extinction by the late 1800s. But in its prime, buffalo roast was more than food. It was the taste of the plains themselves, of a beast that had ruled the land long before men built saloons and railroads to tame it. 12. Biscuits and molasses. Simple, sticky, satisfying. When the money ran thin and the trail grew long, biscuits and molasses kept cowboys upright. The biscuits were born of necessity. Flour, lard, salt, and sour milk slapped together, baked quick in Dutch ovens or iron skillets until crisp outside and tender within. No yeast, no sugar, just grit in edible form. Then came the molasses, dark, thick, and shelf-stable. A drizzle on top transformed survival bread into something resembling comfort. Sweetness wasn't luxury out here, it was fuel. For Southern cowboys, that taste was home. For everyone else, it was a reminder that simple things could still soothe, even on the edge of civilization. 13. Fried calf brains. It wasn't on the chalkboard, but it was on the menu. When cattle were slaughtered, every piece had a place, even the head. The brains were cleaned, sliced, dusted in flour, and fried until the outside crisped golden and the inside turned creamy, almost custard soft. Served hot with mustard, onions, or chili sauce, they became a delicacy in towns with German, French, or Mexican roots, cultures that had long traditions of eating offal. The taste? Mild, almost like eggs. The texture? Crisp shell, soft heart. For some cowboys, it was a dare. For others, it was breakfast, often fried with eggs and bread into a kind of frontier scramble. Strange? Maybe. But in saloons, nothing went to waste, and anything fried was fair game. To waste meat was weakness. To eat it was proof you could stomach the West in all its forms. 14. Game jerky, venison, elk, antelope. The bar snack of the frontier wasn't peanuts or pretzels. It was jerky. Hunters brought it in from the woods. Venison, elk, antelope, cut into strips, salted, smoked, and dried until it chewed like leather but tasted like survival. Seasoned with pepper, sage, or juniper when cooks had the time, it carried flavor as sharp as the land itself. Saloons sold it by the plate, pairing it with whiskey or beer. Tough, chewy, unyielding, jerky was the West itself in edible form. A man could tuck a strip in his cheek and chew for an hour, letting the salt and smoke trickle into his blood. Proof that you belong to the wilderness as much as it belonged to you. 15. Miner's pot pie. In boom towns where miners and saloons lived side by side, the kitchens needed a dish that filled the gut, didn't break the purse, and could be made in bulk. The answer was miner's pot pie. Forget the creamy versions you know today. These pies were rough-hewn, loaded with whatever meat was on hand. Beef chunks, rabbit, squirrel, stewed down with onions and root vegetables, then poured into cast-iron pans lined with dough. Sometimes that dough was true pastry, rolled thick. More often, it was biscuit dough slapped on top, heavy and filling. Baked behind saloons or beside blacksmith forges, the pies were sliced and served hot, sometimes with pickles or beans on the side. They were hearty, bubbling, and messy. 16. Cornmeal mush with tallow drizzle. Before grits filled Southern tables, cornmeal mush kept the frontier alive. Made from coarse cornmeal boiled slow in water or milk until thick, it was poured into pans, cooled until firm, then sliced into slabs and fried until golden. In saloons, it was served both ways, sweet with molasses or sorghum, or savory with a drizzle of rendered beef tallow, salt, and pepper. Cornmeal mush was cheap, easy to make in big batches, and filling enough to keep railroad workers, cowboys, and drifters on their feet. It was poor man's food, but it didn't pretend to be anything else. In truth, it was polenta by another name, frontier style, built for survival rather than style. A plate of it, hot and crisp, was often the dividing line between hunger, gnawing at your ribs, and enough strength to keep walking. 17. Wild turkey and dumplings. When the plains ran dry of beef and buffalo, saloons in wooded country turned to the birds scratching through the underbrush. Wild turkey was tough but plentiful, and with patience, it turned into something worth savoring. The bird was boiled long and slow, its meat stripped and dropped back into a pot rich with onion, garlic, pepper, and whatever herbs a cook could get his hands on. The real star came last. Dumplings. Clumps of flour dough spooned into the bubbling broth, puffing up like clouds in a storm, soaking up flavor until they became soft, doughy treasures. The result was rustic but comforting, a dish cowboys remembered as the closest thing to Sunday supper back home. For the right man, it was a meal worth stopping mid-poker hand to savor, proof that even on the edge of the frontier, a little tenderness could survive. 18. Dried apple pie. Fresh apples were rarer than gold dust in most frontier towns, but dried apples, shriveled, leathery, shipped west by wagon, gave saloon cooks a chance at something resembling home. The apples were soaked back to life in water spiced with cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar, then simmered into a sticky filling. This was spooned into a crust made from flour, water, and lard. No butter, no delicacy, just a thick shield of dough that could survive the brutal heat of cast iron and camp ovens. Some pies came open-faced, others topped with a second crust if flour was plentiful. They were dense, sturdy, meant to last. But one bite, with that tart sweet filling still smoky from the fire, could take a cowboy straight back to orchard country he hadn't seen since boyhood. It wasn't cheap. Dried fruit had to travel far, but a slice of apple pie in a dusty saloon was worth every cent. For some, it tasted sweeter than whiskey. 19. Fried corn cakes, Johnny cakes. They called them Johnny cakes, but to a cowboy they were simply fried corn cakes, the frontier's bread, born from indigenous recipes and carried west by settlers. The batter was cornmeal, salt, and boiling water. Sometimes a splash of milk. Nothing fancy. It was ladled onto a hot griddle or skillet, fried until the edges curled and the center browned, crisp outside, chewy within. In saloons, Johnny cakes were the workhorses of the menu. They didn't spoil, didn't crumble, and could be stacked by the dozen to feed whoever stumbled in from the trail. Sorghum or molasses sweetened them when available. More often, they served as edible plates laid under beans, stews, or meat to soak up the grease. Cowboys judged a cook by his Johnny cakes. If they were thin, tasteless, or burned, men grumbled. If they were crisp, golden, and hearty, the cook had loyal customers. 20. Cow tongue and brown gravy. It sounded strange to some, but for those who knew, cow tongue was a delicacy. Saloon cooks who had the time boiled it for hours with onions and spices until it softened, then peeled away the outer skin and sliced it thin. The slices were seared on hot iron before being smothered in thick brown gravy made from drippings and flour, dark and rich as a thundercloud. The meat was silky, tender, and deeply flavored. Served with fried apples, potatoes, or cornbread, it was the kind of dish that demanded a steady cook and a steady clientele. You didn't rush cow tongue. In frontier towns, it wasn't trail food, it was saloon food. Comfort food for gamblers with coin, marshals with steady pay, or ranch hands celebrating after a long drive. And if you managed to get the last plate of it, you didn't share. You savored every bite. 21st pinto bean chili, without tomatoes. Before chili came in cans or powder mixes, the West knew it as something simpler and fiercer. Early saloon chili was built on beef, beans, and fire. Pinto beans soaked overnight, chunks of beef browned in tallow, and dried chilies, ancho, pasilla, or whatever the cook could grind by hand, pounded into paste. No tomatoes, no frills. Just meat, beans, and heat that bit back. The pot simmered for hours, thickening until it clung to the spoon. Some cooks tossed in onions, garlic, or even a splash of coffee for depth. Others kept it bare. letting the chilies speak for themselves. Cowboys called it a bowl of red, and it came with a warning: ask for mild, and the barkeep would just laugh. Served with sourdough or eaten straight from the pot, chili wasn't just a meal, it was medicine. 22. Bread pudding with whiskey sauce. On the frontier, nothing went to waste, not even stale bread. Bread pudding was the saloon's sweet answer to scarcity. Old biscuits, day-old bread, or leftover cornbread were soaked in milk, sugar, and eggs until they softened into a heavy batter. Baked until golden, the pudding came out soft, spiced, and steaming. Some cooks added raisins or dried apples if they had them. The real luxury, though, was the sauce. Whiskey mixed with butter and sugar, warmed into a glaze, poured over the pudding until it soaked through. Sweet, rich, and burning just enough to remind you it was still the West. It wasn't always on the menu, making it took care and time, but when it appeared, cowboys and drifters lined up. For men who hadn't tasted kindness in months, bread pudding felt like mercy served on a tin plate. 23rd. Fried trout with cornmeal crust. Not all saloons lived on beef and beans. In mountain towns and riverside settlements, the day's catch sometimes took center stage. Fresh trout, pulled from streams that morning, was dredged in coarse cornmeal seasoned with salt and black pepper, then fried in hot pork fat until the skin crackled golden. Served whole, bones and all, the fish came with potatoes or pickled onions when supplies allowed. For stagecoach passengers from back east, fried trout was considered refined dining. For cowboys who'd lived on jerky and beans, it was near heavenly. Delicate, flavorful, and hot off the pan, it carried a touch of luxury on a tin plate. Simple? Yes. But when the barkeep set down a steaming fish with a crust sharp as glass and meat that melted on the tongue, even the hardest drifter paused to enjoy it. 24. Gooseberry cobbler. Wild berries growing along the foothills, tart enough to make your jaw ache. This was the secret weapon of frontier saloon desserts. Gooseberries were foraged, stewed with sugar until they thickened into a jammy filling, then poured into cast-iron pans. On top went spoonfuls of biscuit dough, rough and rustic, baked until browned and crisp at the edges. Served warm, sometimes with cream if the barkeep had a line on a dairy farm, gooseberry cobbler was both sour and sweet. The wild bite of the land tamed into something tender. Cowboys who grew up foraging knew the flavor well. For them, the dish wasn't just dessert, it was memory baked into cast iron. 25. Scrapple. Borrowed from the Pennsylvania Dutch and carried west by settlers, scrapple was a dish built from thrift and necessity. Saloon cooks boiled pork scraps and liver, stirred in cornmeal and spices, and poured the mix into loaf pans to cool. Once set, the scrapple was sliced thick, fried in hot grease until the edges crackled, and served with eggs, mustard, or molasses. It was poor man's food, sure, but it filled a belly fast and could be cooked in bulk to feed a crowd. Crisp outside, soft inside, it was hearty enough to keep a cowboy riding all day. For saloons, scrapple was smart business, cheap to make, easy to serve, and surprisingly satisfying. For the men who ate it, it was proof that nothing went to waste and everything had its place. So were these 25 dishes really served in Wild West saloons? Every last one. 'Cause those smoky rooms weren't only for whiskey and cards. They were the truck stops and diners of their day. The only places where a cowboy could trade dust and distance for a hot plate. Some of these meals were strange, some were simple. A few might turn your stomach, but everyone was real, and each told a story of grit, hunger, and the ingenuity it took to survive. Now it's your turn. Which one would you try? And which would you never touch with a 10-foot pole? If this story left you hungry for more, hit that like button, saddle up with a subscribe, and ride with us next time as we bring more forgotten flavors and tales from the frontier back to life.